So please bear with me. But I would say that being with LAWCHA crowd tonight really does me a lot of good. So thank you all for turning up. I know it's late in December, late in the semester. You got other things to do, so I'm glad that you're here. I'm here to talk about my book, which came out in the spring. This is probably back to front here. Poor Man's Fortune. And as I talk about it, I want to start with kind of a broad overview of just what the book is, where it's set, some of the topics, broad level view of what I'm arguing, how I got to this topic, because I think that story is important, and then kind of walk through the basic structure of the book. It's organized into 3 parts, and then finish with some closing thoughts as we move to questions. So to begin, this book is a history of lead and zinc miners, vast majority of whom were white and native born from the 1850s to the 1950s. It's a case study of what will become known as the Tri-State District, a 5-county area where Kansas, Missouri, and Oklahoma collide. At the district's height in the 1920s, it produced nearly 70% of the nation's zinc and 1/3 of its lead. These were essential base metals for the production of everything from paint to batteries to bullets. For most of its history, these miners rejected labor organization, particularly by unions with social democratic aims. These miners also resisted government regulation of mining practices, especially regarding safety and health. This despite suffering from some of the highest rates of silicosis injury and death in the nation. Although the study is local, the reach is not. Tri-state miners had a broad impact across the Western United States as strikebreakers in repeated clashes with union miners, particularly in the Western Federation of Miners. They captured the attention of union leaders and organizers of all persuasions, from the Knights of Labor to the Western Federation, to Sam Gompers in the AFL, to the IWW, and in the CIO. For some, as a puzzle, to be understood, to be organized, to be grappled with, they captured the attention of others, however, because they posed a mortal threat to their unions and many of their struggles. Tri-state miners helped break nearly every strike the Western Federation of Miners waged between 1896 and 1910. They played a role in the radicalization of the Western Federation and the formation of the IWW, and were in the middle of the AFL-CIO split in the late 1930s. They also captured the attention of industry, medical, and government officials, social occupational reformers, from Alice Hamilton to Francis Perkins to Eleanor Roosevelt. Right. So that's what the book is. What am I arguing? My approach was to write a history of white working class conservatism using the methods of working class history. That is, a history of white working class conservatism from the bottom up, taking seriously these workers as active agents in the creation of their own social, economic, and political ideas. That runs from the Jacksonian market revolution to the New Deal era. So thinking about white working class conservatism not as a post-1950s or 1960s development, but as part of a much deeper trajectory. Right? A long history rooted in the advantages of white men, particularly the native born, in a nation built on state-backed assertions of white dominance in the middle of the 19th century. These origins created conditions in places like the Tri-State District, whereby working class white men who earned their bread by the sweat of their brow, could reasonably expect to prosper from capitalism as prospectors and ultimately, hopefully, as owner-operators of their own small-scale mines. In other words, at least as semi-independent agents in the marketplace based on their own physical labor. Circumstances that gave rise to this vision and that remained broadly true in the tri-state district for more than 40 years, from the 1850s through the 1890s. Defining and anchoring a faith, a white working class male faith in capitalism, in a poor man's capitalism, inherited and reinforced through white social equality, that shaped the thought and action of successive generations of miners, even as the economic advantages they saw were squeezed out by the development of larger industrial mining companies. The development, or the kind of pulling of the tri-state district into industrial capitalist relations, as we might imagine. They sustained that faith even though the material basis of their expectations was diminishing, by transmuting it through an increasingly aggressive assertion of white native-born masculine prerogative, emphasizing racial superiority, emphasizing superiority of their nativity and of their kind of power as men to act immediately in their own regard. And through this, they transformed now permanent forms of wage labor in the district into a market-oriented, through a market-oriented entrepreneurial tradition of white working class independence, often despite alternatives, opposition, other ways offered by labor organizers throughout this period. They did this as strike breakers and after 1900 as piece rate laborers working for wages that they insisted be pegged to market-based sliding scales. So this is, I'll get into this a little bit more later, but piece rates for shoveling ore in the bowels of a mine and arguing with your employer that the piece rate needs to be yoked to the market price of ore. So you're willing, you want a higher wage when the ore goes up, and you're willing to take a lower wage when the price of ore goes down, that this is their prime demand as wage workers in the early 20th century. I argue that miners made these moves with confidence. The confidence rooted in a faith that America would always reward white men. Confidence born in the middle of the 19th century and reinforced in the early 20th century by Jim Crow, by immigration restriction, by imperial expansion, and growing militarism and white nationalism, culminating in World War I. Despite the obvious power of white Americanism, these moves brought them into conflict with unions, but also increasingly government reformers, insurance companies, and corporate managers, particularly as the local mining companies developed into larger and larger concerns, adopting a more modern corporate form. For a time, these miners were able to take and hold a middle position that exploited their opposition to organized labor and their resistance to these growing mining companies. But their robust faith in white nationalism and masculine power to maintain economic advantage left them no real friends and no allies as the Great Depression brought this system to the ground. So that's, that's a very wordy statement of the argument. So where does this project come from? It has its origins in 2008, 2009. I was teaching at the University of Sussex in the United Kingdom, coming to the end of my dissertation, first book project, Spirit of Rebellion, and looking for a new archival project. I wanted to do another kind of deep dive book. But that ninth grader that now accuses me of shouting into Zoom was only 2 or 3 years old at the time. So I needed to find a project where I could go do research and dump her with my parents. That was the plan in 2008, 2009. So I'm from Southwest Missouri. right? I'm from Lawrence County, 30 miles east of this district that I study. So I'm looking in the area. And in 2008, I'd been to a wedding in Seneca, Missouri on the Oklahoma-Missouri border that was really horribly disrupted by a tornado that went through just before the wedding. And before the tornado came through the wedding zone, it hit the town of Pitcher, Oklahoma, which was one of the last major mining towns in this district, where residents in the 1980s, 1990s, and into the 2000s had resisted EPA efforts to remediate the environmental devastation and pollution left over from the mining district. The federal government had been trying to buy them out. They had refused. The tornado hit the town, enabling finally the federal government to clear it out, to buy them out. Like, no, we're not going to rebuild Pitcher. And I thought, well, that's interesting. Why are those people holding on to that place like that? And this was kind of in the wake of debates about Obamacare, about Joe the plumber, Sarah Palin, and who I once heard referred to as part of the Wasilla Hillbillies. And there's kind of moment there where trying to understand white working class conservatism, this Pitcher tornado story, the fate of Pitcher really interested me. And it was when the next year I'd come back, my undergraduate supervisor at Missouri Southern State University in Joplin, Missouri, where I did my BA, Virginia Lass, was telling me, I was talking to her about this. She's like, you know, we were doing oral histories down there one time, and one of the women we were interviewing had a picture on her wall of a chat pile. And a chat pile is like a tailings pile, a pile of mine waste. It's called chat in the tri-state district. And it's the chat pile with this beautiful sunset on it, like it's all lit up by the sunset. And just outside her front window was the same chat pile. So she had a picture of the chat pile she looked at every day on her wall, lit up by a beautiful sunset. And this kind of filtering into my mind, and I thought, I think there's something here about stories about defiant pride and community and meeting amidst industrial and environmental decline, how that's maintained. So that's really where I got started in the late 20th century. But as I looked into it, I kept, as it were, digging deeper. My efforts revealing a rich vein, if we keep the mining metaphor going, of similar stories going back in time to the 40s and the 30s, to the strike-breaking episodes of the early 20th century, the 1890s, back to similar resistance to government regulation and unions in the 1880s and 1870s, right? And so that pushed me back, leaving behind the late 20th century story, but now envisioning a longer project that as a 20th century historian had me really in dangerous territory, the 1840s, right? Like how do you find yourself researching the lead industry in the 1840s, right? Well, I did. And so then put this story together as one, not just of coincidence or episodes that seem to rhyme and conform, but seem to be interconnected. It seemed to be connected in scope and deep, suggesting that this is part of a richer history than might appear at the surface. That adds up to something more substantial than kind of different episodes of resistance. And this was strange because I'm from this place, right? I went to college in Joplin, Missouri, which was the center of the tri-state district. Missouri Southern State College, actually on old mining ground. Occasionally as an undergraduate, mining shafts would open up in the parking lot and swallow people's cars when I was there. But it never occurred to me when I was there that this was an interesting story, like that there's anything to tell about this region. I was more interested in the nearby story of the Appeal to Reason, the socialist newspaper published 40 miles away in Jarod, Kansas, that blew my mind as an undergraduate and really got me started as a labor historian. I was interested in the organizing story, the radical story. The story that was literally under my feet didn't register as history worthy of exploring. And so as I came to this later, I really had to confront really my own blind spots that I had developed, that I had gotten interested in. And when I went to historiography to try to figure out how this long trajectory of anti-unionism, non-unionism, anti-government reform, past generation to generation fit, and I found that the labor historiography failed me as well, right? That my blind spots were in some ways reflected in blind spots of the field more generally, that is interested primarily in organizing stories, in radical traditions. I understand why. That's my first two books are about that. But not much really at all on workers outside of that story, right? Labor historians, we've used bottom-up methods, new labor history methods to explain resistance very well. But non-union workers or anti-union workers, conservative workers more generally, typically are explained by top-down or negative arguments. Employer repression, fear, ignorance, in post-1950s kind of racism and anti-communism. And all those arguments clearly have their merits, especially employer power is central to understanding working class experience. But they didn't offer kind of convincing explanations I was seeking to make sense of this effectively century-long tradition, right? That's durable, rich, and passed between successive generations. And it was about that time I was reading Lawrence Richards' 2008 book, Anti-Union America, that made an explicit call to devote study to exactly these kinds of workers. It's a University of Illinois Press book. It's an excellent book. Just like those we study who joined unions and pursued social democratic visions. So that goes back 10, 12 years ago, kind of responding to that call and trying to do that with this material in this book. You know, another kind of relevant impetus, at the time at Sussex, the university had fired over 100 people, over 60, there's no tenure in the UK, so permanent academics. And I was part of the union on strike, on picket lines, and many of my faculty colleagues were just gleefully walking across the picket line, breaking the strike. Just as I'm trying to get into this history of strike breaking. So, you know, I was thinking about it today, particularly with one of my colleagues being fired, how that played a role in my wanting to grapple with what was going on inside their head. And by doing so through this history. So that's how I got here. The book is structured in 3 parts around an analysis in which I try to track mutually constitutive histories of class, race, and gender within a broader story of organized labor, industrial capitalism, government reform, and American nationalism. It's based on what I, at least personally, have found to be exhausting, and I think it's exhaustive, research in more than 30 archives across 12 states, as well as dozens and dozens of government reports and other published sources. I've really attempted to turn every page I could find about this district to assemble the granular evidence required to adequately and convincingly track worker ideas, motivations, and interpretations over time. Right? So the book is longer than I was contracted for. It's way too long, and it cut significantly, but I felt that paying attention in close detail to language across these generations in this 100 years was important to establishing the argument analysis I'm putting forward. So the first part, it's what I'll call the poor man's camp part. The first 40 years of the tri-state district became known nationally as a poor man's camp, where men with little capital, working with their arms and their backs, alone or in small partnerships, could acquire leaseholds to land, establish their own mines, and market the product of their labor either to local smelters or even further afield to smelters nationally, moving from exploring prospectors to owner-operator miners on a very small scale. The initial deposits of lead in the tri-state district, it was primarily a lead district first, were shallow, fragmented, so able to be reached by human and animal power, pulled out by human and animal power. On the edge of Western Missouri in the 1850s and 1860s, which is the edge of the United States at that point. Indian Territory is to the west, there's no railroad connection. So they're also isolated from Eastern capital, from Eastern industry, on land that's recently been, where Native Americans have recently been removed and is sparsely populated. As native-born white men, they have relatively easy access to that land. So barriers to entry to the poor man's camp are low. And this poor man's camp model persists more or less for 40 years, where this notion that capital poor men can come in and establish their own owner-operator mine was based in reality. At first I thought, man, this is a myth. There's no way this is true. But it turns out it's true. Their success in locating these lead deposits, what became some of the richest lead deposits in the middle of the 19th century, soon attracted outside investors in land, in smelters, who tried to impose control on the marketing of the metal. They don't come in and try to run their own mines. They seek these poor man's camp miners to find and establish paying mines on land or to feed their smelters. Miners pushed back against this kind of effort to constrain their opportunities and actions. Some sought proto-union organizations in the 1870s. Others were attracted to anti-monopoly politics of the Greenback Labor Party in the 1870s and 1880s. But it's interesting, their goals in both boil down to one thing, a quote, duty to sell their mineral to the highest bidder. Right? That they see this as their core interest, ability to market the metal that they mine at open market or fair market prices. But most did not fight outside investors directly. They instead branched out. They sought other land, other areas nearby to try to establish new prospects, to establish new mines, avoiding control. And this process actually helped expand and develop the mining district because they discover that these 5 mines in this one county is not the limits of the underground wealth, but actually it spreads across 3 states. And that process of discovery is led and driven by poor man's camp miners seeking their own owner-operator affair, with investors and smelters kind of following them, right, as they discover what in the 1850s are the richest lead mines in the United States. Giving the district a reputation as a poor man's camp, right, where men with little capital can come and prosper with their appetite for hard work, willingness to risk, digging holes looking for metal. Not easy work. Newcomers to the district, attracted by this process, looked to the men who had come before them, men of very similar social status, white men who spoke English, and saw them as evidence that they too could achieve the same things. That what the immediate generation had done served as evidence of what was possible in the future. Right? I see that throughout the late 19th century, right? As successive waves of newcomers come in. The social homogeneity of district miners makes it easy to imagine that and expect that you should do the same things. Now, their efforts began with lead, but soon yielded rich deposits of zinc, which no one could really smelt until the late 1860s because you had to have very high temperatures in order to smelt it. But by the late 1860s, those smelters were being built, creating a new market for what had previously been seen as worthless metal in the district. So the zinc kind of adds new fuel for the poor man's camp to spread new opportunities. But zinc was worth much less than lead per weight, so required slightly more machinery, more scale, generally an increase in the size of the workings, maybe one or two more hired hands to make a mine pay anything. Right? So the discovery and really creation of a Western zinc industry comes from owner-operator miners, usually working on their own account, but sets in train a series of events that leads zinc mining companies to grow in scale and start to adopt a more heavily capitalized form with steam engines and pumps and larger crews of wage laborers that by the 1890s will doom or close the poor man's camp opportunities, right? Make barriers to entry too high. But I have to stress that this was a gradual transformation led by men who had been recently working miners in their own right. They were neighbors and bosses of younger men who again took confidence in their example. So that poor man's camp section, the first 3 or so chapters, comes to end in the 1890s. Beginning the second part of the book is really the transition to wage labor. As poor man's camp prospecting closed, really the only opportunity for most miners was permanent wage labor in these mines. And they responded to that reality with increasingly aggressive individual assertions of kind of restless, immediate masculinity and white native-born prerogative. Expressed first as miners seized opportunities as strikebreakers throughout the West. So the cradle of what I would call entrepreneurial wage labor is the strike-breaking episodes that take place across the West, where tri-state miners go by the hundreds and thousands to work in the place of Western Federation of Miners strikers, often negotiating with labor procurers, with private detectives to ensure that they get high wages, often as high or higher than the union was on strike to achieve. And they're so successful, helping break the strike in Leadville in 1896, later in Coeur d'Alene in 1899, Cripple Creek in 1903, all the way through the Black Hills gold strike in 1910, that they quickly become a prized asset by Western mining corporations, and they learn to market themselves to Western mining corporations as hired guns, really, known for their fearlessness in the face of the Western Federation, and having no qualms with being a scab or being a strikebreaker. They occasionally take issue to the word scab. But that's in part because they come to see strikebreaking as really part of their prerogative as white native-born American men, and the efforts of union miners to restrict their activities. Union miners who were, in many places in the West, a majority foreign-born group, as kind of unjust interlopers, unjust enemies, right? And this justification becomes increasingly grounded in these assertions of white native-born superiority. So this conflict spreads across the West. I track it through all of these strike zones, the kind of escalating tensions between tri-state miners and the Western Federation of Miners, with increased demonization on both sides that makes any possible resolution for what the Western Federation of Miners sought to do, which was organize the tri-state district, much harder to achieve. And it's kind of deepening enmity, this cascade of epithets and songs about each other, just really add fuel to this growing rancor that permanently divides the two in many ways. Tri-state miners brought their experiences and ideas as strikebreakers home to the tri-state district, where when Western Federation of Miners organizers shows up, trying to organize them, they are already primed with anti-union ideas in their minds about this kind of foreign kind of radical force, right, that complicates union organizing attempts for the rest of the district's production history. At the same time, tri-state miners were adapting entrepreneurial ideas about work to wage labor in the district through the piece rate job of shoveling, right, the hand-loading ore that I described earlier, insisting on piece rates tied to a sliding scale and pursuing those piece rates with a ferocity that shocked their employers, shocked their observers. Men equipped just with a shovel, shoveling tens of thousands of pounds a day of ore, in some cases 100 tons a day by one man with a shovel in pursuit of these piece rate wages. And in the process, shaping a new self-conception of themselves as free, strong white men who are willing to push their bodies to the absolute limit in pursuit of economic interest. This mixes with the strike-breaking experiences and stories to sustain faith in capitalism for loyal, hardworking, risk-taking white men. This transition is in place by 1905 and 1910. The problem is that local mining companies soon found the shovelers a problem because their high wages were too expensive, making too much money, also creating labor shortages in the camp by gallivanting around as strikebreakers. And so they start to try to rein them in as well, prompting backlash and resistance, but not really through union organization. The WFM, the AFL tried, but it was, the WFM particularly was poisoned by Western clashes. Some miners tried to form independent unions for white native-born men only, some in direct affiliation with the AFL. But
Jarod, I'm gonna ask you to kind of wrap it up in the next minute, so we can get some questions in.
Yeah. What they pushed for most in one was a wage scale, including a piece rate, track the market price of ore, closer connection to capitalism, just as American belligerents in the Great War revived metal markets and militant white nationalism. I've got a third part, but obviously I'm going way over time here. So I'm going to cut it off right there. That's the first two parts. If you want to figure out what happens in the third part, you just have to buy the book or ask me about it. Thank you.
He left us on a cliffhanger.
I did. What could possibly?
I'd like to give Jarod a hand and thank him. You can, unmute and clap, or give the little emoji, or just go ahead and clap, whichever you want to do. But appreciate you for giving us the time. I'd like to open it up for questions now. If people want to begin to post your questions in the chat box, and as I mentioned, I will call on you and then ask you to unmute, and then you can ask your question directly, and then mute yourself back. And if everyone could remember just to stay muted if you are not asking a question. We could have let you go on for another minute or two, apparently, Jarod. The cliffhanger threw everybody.
I didn't really get to I got my closing points. I could.
We have a question from Eileen Boris. Eileen, do you want to go ahead and unmute?
What kind of households did they form, and how did sort of women fit into this kind of masculinity in this world they were creating?
Yeah. Thank you, Eileen. Great question. It's really fascinating because nuclear family groups are really central to mining communities in the district from the very beginning. Often coming from older mining camps in eastern Missouri or Wisconsin, Illinois, and Iowa, the lead mining district in the Galena, Illinois lead mining district. So you see in the 1850s, 1860s, maybe 2/3 of mining households miners are in nuclear family households, wife, husband, children, but often providing a support structure for single individual miners who are coming from these similar places, who they take on as boarders. The poor man's camp period tends to favor older miners who have been working longer, have accrued some money, some experience, are able to negotiate the best leaseholds. They tend to be in what you might think of as traditional family groups. The strike breakers, the shovelers, and the kind of turn to entrepreneurial wage labor in the 20th century privileges younger men, specifically because they have the kind of physical power and belief that their physical power is infinite, right? Which they expend very quickly, but they believe it's infinite. They tend to be single or unmarried. And so as we get to turn to more aggressive masculinity, see more of a focus on single, unrestrained, boozing, sexually rapacious young men from 1900 into the 20s at least. And women starting crucial roles, supplementing household incomes, keeping things afloat while their men are prospecting and kind of taking all the surplus, literally, as one mine inspector says, dumping it into holes in the ground. That this whole poor man's camp is really upheld by the labor of women, cooking, taking in cleaning, laundry, and so on in the district.
Okay. Our next question comes from Tony Gilpin. Would you like to unmute?
Sure. Yeah, I just, it's up there in the chat somewhere. So just wondering about the film, that little short film that I had just discovered recently, but you probably know really well, called Men in Dust. Could you just talk about that? It's kind of extraordinary, and how it plays in and what the significance of it is.
I absolutely love Men in Dust. If you haven't seen Men in Dust, which is on YouTube, it's 16 minutes. Sheldon Dick and Lee Dick from 1940. It's based on, so in the 1930s, I could talk for 50 minutes about this. There's a strike in 1935 launched by a minority of miners who had joined Mine Mill, who are trying to hold on to the dying embers of the National Industrial Recovery Act, 7A rights, before they ruled unconstitutional. The strike starts and then is quickly broken by a back to work movement that's co-opted and supercharged by mining companies that really folds in all of the earlier history of strike breaking and anti-union animosity as the history kind of comes crashing in the 1930s as 2/3 of district miners organized to break a strike by 1/3 of their coworkers. That leads to a long drawn out battle through the National Labor Relations Board, a lot of it focusing at the end on the silicosis crisis, attracting outside support from the Communist Party. And that's the context in which Lee Dick and Sheldon Dick come in to create this film to try to publicize what mine mill activists were trying to achieve in the tri-state district as they're battling against this blue card union, company union in 1939 and 1940. It features a very prominent 1930s union activist, Tony McTeer, in it, who I quote in the book. Eleanor Roosevelt screened it in the White House. It was screened. Francis Perkins came to the district in 1940 to hold a silicosis conference, screened during that conference as well. It's a fascinating look at the district. It is a highly partisan version of what was happening in the 1930s, but everyone should watch it.
Our next question comes from Jillian Jacqueline. Would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Hi, thank you. I really enjoyed your talk, Professor Roll, and I'm really excited about your book coming out. Actually just recently completed my dissertation in August, which was very much about white working class conservatism. I'm actually in the Fox River Valley of Wisconsin, so it was really place-based. And it wasn't about a particular industry per se, but it was very much about how cultural values shaped people's political perspectives. And one of the challenges I had was like defining things like, you know, conservatism and progressivism and so on. So I was curious, for you, at least in your study, what constitutes white working class conservatism in particular? Who was the working class? How were they conservative? And why should we care?
Thank you. This is very much a focus on miners, right? Workers who, from as prospectors or owner operators to wage laborers, did the hard physical labor in the mine, lived in social experience rooted around their work, their economic position, right? That they have a sense of themselves as working class, as distinct from skilled workers, distinct from their bosses, their professionals, and so on. And I try to track the development of this working class consciousness, a very particular kind, I think, throughout the book. Their conservatism comes, as I see it, in the ways that so the things that they see as their interests and that they pursue socially and politically, and the way they respond to alternative ideas, right? So I pay deep attention in the book to efforts of union organizers to argue with them, to convince them to join the AFL, join the Knights of Labor, join the Western Federation of Miners, and then track their responses, right? And particularly the broad pattern of either not seeing union interests as their self-interest in union interests, or coming to see unions as antagonistic to their interests, right? So in their own words, but also looking at how union organizers across the spectrum, government, regulators, even their bosses, talk about them and describe their views. So trying to come up with a multi-perspective, many viewpoints on what they're saying and doing to try to get to some understanding of how they're understanding themselves.
So we're going to switch the format a little bit, and I'm going to go ahead and just ask people's questions for them so that we have a lot of questions lined up, and I'm going to try to get them in. So I just want to try and get to them fast. So the next question is from Bob Rossi, and he asks, was any part of the conservatism a reaction to Northern Mineral Mine Workers Progressive Union? Is there a Civil War connection? I know of the tri-state miners in Fremont County, Colorado, who became coal miners and cement plant workers there. Fremont has a Confederacy tie-in.
There's not much direct involvement or engagement with Northern Mineral. Northern Mineral organized deep lead mines in eastern Missouri and in the early 20th century, or before it merged with Western Federation of Miners. But actually the tri-state district has certainly some, in the mid-19th century, Confederate sympathizers, Confederate soldiers. LAWCHA, Missouri, which is 10 miles west of the main mines, was the Confederate capital of Missouri in the early 1860s, but also miners who sympathized with the United States, who were Republicans. And so politically, the district was very evenly balanced from the 1850s through Roosevelt, through the 1930s, with Democrats and Republicans kind of winning one county, one winning the other, and it being fairly closely, finally poised. So there's definitely a Civil War component to the history, but I don't see it as determinative of the broader pattern of what these miners say and do.
Okay. Our next question came from Julie Green. Julie asks, can you connect their conservatism with voting patterns? And what happened to earlier traditions of Southwestern radicalism as explored, for example, by James Green?
I don't connect it to voting patterns. I don't find any connection. I mean, they're kind of trends. So some miners voted Republican because they believed tariffs were going to raise oil prices, and that was their route to prosperity. The great report from a Western Federation of Miners organizer who says, you know, I went to all these places, I talked to them, they think Taft and tariff is their way to success in 1908. There are others, however, who vote for Bryan in 1908 or back into the 1890s. I don't know. I found it really impossible to discern any pattern looking at precinct level stuff, county level stuff. What's interesting in the 1930s is that there's a massive swing to Roosevelt in 1932. But you get both mine mill miners and company blue card union miners voting for Roosevelt, right? In 1932, 1936 especially, which I think is really fascinating for me to think about what we conclude when we look at voting totals from the 1930s and what that masks in terms of divisions within the New Deal coalition. Like voting for Roosevelt in 1936 could tell us a lot, but it also could hide a lot. And I think the story of what happens in Ottawa County, Oklahoma in 36, where the strike-breaking union is holding a rally after a major victory over Mine Mill. They're playing Happy Days Are Here Again in a county building that was recently built by FIRA. And it's a company union celebrating their defeat over Mine Mill. So there's complexity within what looks like partisan agreement or partisan unity. With Southwestern socialism, with the rural socialism, yeah, so particularly Southern and Western Oklahoma, Southeast Missouri, you have very strong rural socialist movements. In the coal region of Crawford County, Kansas, which is right next to this district, you have the Appeal to Reason published there. Debs, Kate Richards O'Hare, all the luminaries of early American socialism changed trains in Joplin, which is the heart of the tri-state district. And socialists never, they get maybe at max 15% of the vote in the tri-state district, which includes a lot of farmers and other people, not just miners. They certainly knew about each other. The socialists are always in Joplin, trying to help the Western Federation. Actually, the Appeal to Reason writes about them, comments on them. It's not as if they don't know they exist or the ideas are there. The alternatives are right at their doorstep, but they have no purchase or very limited purchase.
Okay, our next question comes from Bob Hutton. Bob writes, I was just reading about Justice Collins's judicious mixture strategy of keeping Black, white, and immigrant West Virginia coal miners at each other's throats in the 1890s. Did you see a similar strategy in the three-state area, and did it have an effect on miner conservatism?
I don't see it until the 1890s, but it doesn't come from local mining companies. And there are like 500 mining companies in 1904, right? I mean, this is in a 5-county area. It's just like a massive proliferation. But it comes from strikebreaker recruiters coming from Colorado, who are writing back, the field, the detective agency, writing back to mine bosses in Colorado saying, these are all native-born Americans. They don't believe in labor unions. And they are the ones where I see that link being made, right? And it's really in the strike-breaking zones where the miners start to make that link themselves. That's where the kind of racist and xenophobic justification of their strike-breaking and anti-unionism is forged. is in those very tense, heavily militarized, the palpably violent Western strike zones that then comes back to the tri-state district with those strike breakers in the context, it should be said, of just a national turn to white supremacy and xenophobic nativism at the same time. So it definitely a strategy that I see introduced by private detectives, part of the strike breaking, but also hard to separate from the broader context.
Okay, our next question comes from Janet Green. Janet asks, is this really conservative behavior, or is it a response to new opportunity for income, which, as you know, is blocked by changes in the amount of capital needed to get involved in production? What is the dynamic between these anti-union employers and the employers who were happy to exploit these men with shovel as long as it was profitable for them to do so?
So I think it's conservative behavior. I don't see it as opportunistic responses to immediate opportunities or circumstances or situations. I see a broader pattern that echoes over time, that builds over time. And I think that we can trace its development over time, so that, and that we have, in the words of union organizers themselves, trying to explain what's happening here from the 1930s all the way back to the 1870s, that by and large reach the same conclusions and report the same things. That there is a worldview, an ideology, if you will, that goes beyond simple immediate reactions to circumstances. Right?
Okay. Our next question.
The second one. Right.
Go ahead.
I'm not sure which anti-union employers Janet means.
Okay, we can circle back around to that if we have time. Our next question comes from Janine Drake, who has two related questions. To what extent is the working class conservatism something that arises out of the South? That's one question. And then, are the Western miners without the 19th century history of entrepreneurship as miners, just as anti-union as those in the East?
So in terms of regional origins, the aspect of this setting that I find both challenging, but also I think revealing, is that the tri-state district is neither Southern nor Midwestern nor Western. It's the kind of western flank of the Ozarks where the Great Plains start. It's really it's a very mixed, muddled area. That was Confederate capital of Missouri, but also many of the mining companies were from St. Louis and tied to the Republican Party and friends with Abraham Lincoln. Miners who came there initially came from Wisconsin, Illinois, Iowa. Some of those miners had been born in Alabama. So there's this national migration chasing the metal that traverses our regional divisions we think of now. So like, is it the South? Like, I'm not sure. Yes and no. In the West, in some places they start as poor man camps in the West in the 1860s and 1870s, very quickly turn into very heavily industrialized sites. And what's interesting is, as tri-state strikebreakers go west, they are often able to attract many union miners, particularly native-born white miners, Cornish-born miners, to join them as strikebreakers against the Western Federation. So they're actually able to split WFM locals on ethnic national lines. So, native-born whites, Cornish miners follow them to work. And it's typically Irish-born miners and other miners who stay loyal to the strike and loyal to the union. And the mine owners find very seductive and very powerful, that almost like lemmings, that miners of similar social and national background, they will follow them. Right? And this happens in multiple strikes, particularly Leadville. And that's what I find interesting, is the way that their example is able to peel away men who are like them, away from solidarity, away from collective action, away from the union. And you see this all the way through the 1930s.
We've got just 2 more questions. So Melvin Dubofsky asks, isn't it a great jump to conclude that their individualism and masculinity was anyway related to their understanding of capitalism or their self-conception as aspiring capitalists?
I don't think it's a great jump. I think I see it in the evidence. Beginning in the 1860s, 1870s, in the words miners themselves are using, and the words their foes or enemies are using, all the way through the teens and into the 20s, particularly oriented around market-based sliding scales despite very reasonable and attainable alternative visions.
Okay, and our last question of the night comes from Michael Pierce, who asks, did the lead/zinc miners scab against the area's coal miners? Tri-state coal miners were among the most left-wing in the UMWA in the first decades of the 20th century.
Not that I could find. UMWA miners from the coal fields in Crawford County, Kansas, south central Oklahoma, came to the Tri-State District often in league with the Western Federation or the Oklahoma Federation of Miners and the Oklahoma Federation of Labor in the 1920s, trying to assist organizing efforts. Often during UMWA strikes in the coal fields, union miners came to try to find work in tri-state mines to tide themselves over, which is another source of tension between tri-state miners and this growing antipathy to unionism.
Okay, thank you so much for pulling through and staying to answer all the questions. And thanks so much for everybody who stayed to the last question. We really appreciate it. Thanks for asking such great questions. And I'd like to thank Jarod for coming on board and, talking with us at this difficult time. We really appreciate it. So thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I really do appreciate it.
And I want to remind everybody that I posted a link in the beginning of the chat to so that you can catch up and go to UNC Press's website to get Jarod's book. And I also listed the upcoming LAWCHA Pandemic Book Talks. We have Alex Finley in January with An Intimate Economy, Enslaved Women Work, and America's Domestic Slave Trade. In February, we have Tony Gilpin on the 18th. We have Tony Gilpin, The Long Deep Grudge, A Story of Big Capital, Radical Labor, and Class War in the American Heartland. And on March 18th, we have Christina Viviana Groger, The Education Trap, The Schools and the Remaking of Inequality in Boston. So please join us again. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Good night.